Hello everyone, welcome back to another review, and this time we're talking about Suicide Squad numbers 32 to 43, which is the next 12 issues in John Ostrander's original Suicide Squad run. Now, I said last time that the previous set of issues from 21 to 31 are essentially when the book really ran with its premise and really moved things forward and finally got to a place where you could see why Suicide Squad was such a major run of that era. I think by the time you read this set of issues, it's impossible not to love this book. This is probably the single best string of issues we've had, and oddly enough, we don't have my two favorite characters in it for very much at all. Deadshot's in it a little bit, and Rick Flag isn't in it at all, and I still love the crap out of these issues. These are so good. So let's go ahead and talk about them in a little bit more detail than just them being great. So last time I talked a little bit about Amanda Waller needing someone to check her and someone to kind of pull her back when she's being irrational, and the problem with that being that she's always too authoritarian, too dominating to be able to get a person that reliable. Well, here she finally gets a new psychiatrist that is able to do that, and Waller can't do anything about it. She's finally been kind of forced into a position where she can't argue with much, and we also developed that Flo, who's one of the people that will help run the Suicide Squad under Waller, has become friends with Oracle. And we've been running with this very small side plot that she's got a crush on Bronze Tiger, and she's extremely jealous of Vixen. And it feels kind of childish, kind of schoolgirly, but that actually develops into something a little bit bigger when we go down the rest of these issues. Now, there's maybe three major stories that happen here. There's the Apocalypse stuff, there's the stuff with the Loa, and then there's the Phoenix Gambit. And all of these issues lead right into each other. There's no point where an issue just kind of feels like it's hanging in the middle of everything. There's a flow from issue to issue. There's a flow from arc to arc. The big thing that we open with is that one of the members of the Suicide Squad, who is a former member of the Jihad, has been captured and is going to be executed in Iran. And the Suicide Squad is going to go and capture them, or trying to recapture them, so because mainly he's a U.S. citizen now, and so the U.S. has to do something about it, and that it's kind of a completely politically defined as opposed to being morally defined. The interesting thing about it is that Ostrander is able to make a pretty interesting argument on both fronts. Ostrander's politics have been kind of leaning a little bit more one way than the other, but he's really here able to prove that he's a writer that could understand both positions, even if he agrees with one more than the other, and even if the audience agrees with one more than the other. What we have here is when Raven is taken to be executed and the Suicide Squad go to get him, Vixen says that this guy was part of the U.S. installed regime that tortured and abused and killed the people there. Who are we to go and take away their chance at justice? And she compares it to the equivalent of the U.S. saving a Nazi war criminal, or Germany at this point in time trying to save a Nazi war criminal. What good could possibly come out of that, no matter your loyalties? That there's an inherent moral problem with that. And Bronze Tiger makes a very consequentialist argument in that Iran violated diplomatic immunity, and how are we able to resolve any conflict whatsoever when the core tenet of diplomacy is violated in such a way, and that we have to do something about it. So you can see you can see the argument on both fronts, and one you can still lead way more to it than the other. But the idea is that things are not absolutely black and white, and that some of these decisions are truly hard to make, and it's something that's been coming through in the book pretty slowly up to this point. The moral dilemmas of going around and just forcing U.S. interest in every other country has been something that we haven't talked too much about, but it's definitely been in the background throughout the whole run. But one of the issues with it really coming out and really saying something great is that DC doesn't like to use real countries or real cities. So we have a mention of Iran and Tehran a little bit, and we get some Cold War stuff, we get some Russia stuff, but that's about it. Almost every other city we get in this whole run, up to this point, up to issue 43, tend to be made-up DC countries, with made-up DC history, with made-up DC conflict, and I don't have a problem with that necessarily. I mean, you could definitely use fictional locations to talk about real things. We do this all the time. The problem, though, is we're always in the middle of a conflict, and we always get like a really quick abridged history for this made-up location. So we aren't able to really say anything about political history or the Cold War or anything like that, because we don't really have a strong frame of reference. Now, imagine if the Phoenix Gambit issues at the end of this, when there's a revolution in a country, isn't Count Vertigo's home country, but is instead something like, see, now I'm trying to think of a late Cold War turf. I mean, we could use the most cliche example because everyone would know the history of this. What if we said it was Vietnam? What if we said it was Vietnam and we're able to not only tell a story about a revolution occurring in Vietnam, but the history of the turmoil and the conflict that led up to that point, that everyone can bring their own knowledge into it and move that story more forward and give it a little bit more layer. It's something they can't really do with fictionalized DC countries because no one's under any mandate to keep to get a sense of verisimilitude with that type of history, and so that makes it a little bit less political, even though the book is trying very hard to be a strongly political book. But that's maybe the biggest issue. Not much else is important, and criticism-wise aside from that. So let's keep going with this. One of the Suicide Squad members, whose name is Duchess, who we've speculated for a very long time in the book, is probably someone from Apocalypse after the second or third issue when the female Furies attacked and tried to steal G. Gordon Godfrey from Belle Reve prison, and one of the female Furies gets left behind, and it turns out to be Duchess. And we haven't confirmed it up until this point. Everyone kind of knows, but no one's really acting on it, and that becomes a thing later down the line. So she's a female Fury. She decides to knock out all the Suicide Squad and force them to go into Apocalypse to serve as cannon fodder to regain her place as leader of the female Furies. And what we have there is the moment you're a loser, no one wants to support you in Apocalypse, but the moment you're a winner, everyone will join your side. So all Duchess really has to do is kick the ass of the woman that stabbed her in the back. And the Suicide Squad, as they've always been, are used as cannon fodder. The difference is now they're doing it without any sort of governmental backing. So there's more humanity to them potentially being killed, as opposed to when they're just instruments of the government. And one of the big points being made here is that Darkseid is the ultimate example of authoritarian dictatorship. But his style of government and his rule and his grasp of power is actually less frightening than what the United States does. Because what the United States does is that it corrupts people to the core where there's no structure whatsoever. And there's a big statement here being made about the distribution of power, and the distribution of power forcing people to alter what's inherently valuable to something that is just fictionalized, something that's created to separate people more. And we talk about this a little bit with racism and such, but it really comes out when you get to Darkseid, and you realize that, wow, even the ultimate evil at least has some sort of direction, and can't fight the direction he goes in, whereas Cold War politics have just forced people to be completely uncivil in trying to work towards a common goal. And there's a really interesting panel right after all the Darkseid stuff where the new leaders of the Suicide Squad, the people above Amanda Waller, Sergeant Steele and Faraday, and one other guy who's not important really, they're talking about what they want to do and how they want to set an example, and so they call him Bronze Tiger, who's the new mission leader ever since Rick Flag left. And Faraday says that the only reason they want to roast Bronze Tiger, and the reason they want to hit Amanda Waller so hard and get rid of her, is because they're black. And the point being made, and the thing he says, is that the way the power structure works is that it doesn't like redistribution, and it doesn't like when everyone's on equal terms. And so the central problem with the whole thing is that it would rather divide people into as many sects as possible as opposed to unite them. And so Darkseid's apocalypse dictatorship looks a little bit better because at least everyone's involved and at least everyone has a part to play. Even if it's a horrible, evil direction, at least the people are together. And that's not something you can say about the nature of the Cold War politics and the nature of the United States and what they do to people that don't agree with them. And again, that's why I think if you use real countries, it would have worked a little bit better, because you could add some actual history to that claim. And the racism thing is kind of a big issue. It's something that proves Ostrander was ahead of its time, and he's able to extrapolate this book into stuff that's happening right now, even though it's written years and years before. And the racism thing becomes sort of the linchpin to all of this, that if you can figure out and save that, maybe there's hope after all. But the problem is that the way the structure is created is that it promotes racism, and it promotes the acquisition of power and a need for control from birth, and that's not inherently valuable. And that's something Amanda Waller's been struggling with her whole life, and that she's always sort of been after power and constantly pushed back and forth because of who has the power and who doesn't. And she finally gets to this point here where when the Suicide Squad is shut down, she just kind of gives up, and she has a plan in the back of her mind of how she wants things handled and how she wants things to work in the future, but she has to get away from the government, and she has to get away from the forced nature of power. And that stuff's really, really interesting. And that's not to say the entire book is nothing but like heavy politics and stuff. There's actually some fun comedic stuff going on here. While we're talking about all of this, Dr. Light gets a little bit more to do, and Dr. Light's really pathetic. If you've ever read Dr. Light, he's extremely pathetic. The only time he hasn't been pathetic is in Identity Crisis, and then he's more controversial than pathetic. And here we find out that he's actually, unless you already know his backstory, he's been haunted by his partner who created the Dr. Light suit and wanted to be a superhero, but Dr. Light killed him and became a villain instead, so his ghost is constantly haunting him. But then Light ends up getting convinced by the ghost to be a superhero, and so he does become a superhero, and the moment he tries to save the day, he gets killed on Apocalypse, and now he's just a ghost floating around in the background of the whole book with the other ghost that was haunting him, and it's kind of hilarious. And in the middle of this, we also resolve who the Mad Pyre is, and it turns out it is Captain Boomerang. I was right. He actually staged the situation where he got pied, where he threw a boomerang, he threw the pie like a boomerang and timed when it would come back to him and got hit, and that's why he was conveniently there in all the right places at the right time, and that's really fun. So all that stuff's really great. The next really great thing that we get here is we get more stuff with Bronze Tiger, and we talked a little bit about the racism stuff, but we also get some of his backstory and this idea that from early childhood he's always wanted to temper his need for anger and his need for violence and the joy he gets out of it, and that again being sort of artificially created by the nature of the power structure. And so he's constantly trying to learn and better himself, and constantly trying to focus on the human inherently valuable, but is always forced into situations where the immaterial gets to him, and he gets stuck into the League of Assassins, and the power of symbolism really helps him overcome that when he puts all of his anger into a tiger mask, and it's also something that's able to break him, and it just goes to show that under the rulership that he lives in, under the government that he lives in, he's never going to be able to be free of that anger, and so he just kind of embraces it, and he doesn't create a separation of identity between Ben Turner and Bronze Tiger, and now realizes that everything violent about Bronze Tiger is just in him inherently, and he's kind of been corrupted to that point, and he shares that with Amanda Waller quite a bit. The other thing is that Flo, that the character I mentioned earlier that had a crush on Bronze Tiger and has been friends with Oracle, ends up dying on Apocalypse. And what we get here is, to connect to everything else, is a very clear death of innocence. And here we do also confirm that Oracle is Barbara Gordon. We see her crying when she hears that Flo dies, but no one can see it because she's hiding away. And she's got a Batgirl toy on her desk, and all of those symbols really connect to this idea that the longer this type of politicking goes on, the more and more we're in for the destruction of human nature. And I really, really love all of that stuff. There's a clear separation being made between a monster and a criminal, and a lot of that goes back to who's in power versus who's been corrupted by those in power, and there's no middle ground to that, and that stuff just becomes endlessly fascinating. By the end of the Dark Side stuff, Amanda Waller's outed as being the real leader to the Suicide Squad, and that the figurehead she created was just a fabrication, and that all goes back and deals with the Loa, and this is basically just an excuse to get Amanda Waller thrown in jail. And so she does get thrown in jail, but not before she takes a couple members of the Suicide Squad, Poison Ivy and Deadshot, to basically massacre the Loa. And then they get to run away, and Amanda Waller decides she's just going to go straight to jail, and she has it figured out in her mind what she wants to do. And she decides not to fight back in court or anything like that. She just decides that she's going to wait it out. And so she does, and that ends issue 39. And then issue 40 through 43 is something called the Phoenix Gambit, which is a 4-issue arc that takes place 1 year later. And in 1 year later, basically what we have is Amanda Waller's still in jail, but now the government needs her to kind of curve what's going on with Count Vertigo and the Cold War. And so she decides, okay, I'll do it, but now the Suicide Squad gets to be under my control full-time. I get a full presidential pardon, and we become a freelance organization separated from the government. And she completely gets her way. And the big idea there being that, yes, the freelancing will lead to more corruption because now it's all about money. But at least it's not about, at least it's separated from the governmental need to corrupt. And so she has to carve out her own little niche to figure things out. And we get Batman in this a little bit. And I guess the problem with Batman is that he helps recruit members for the new Suicide Squad. And I don't think Batman would do that. It seems just not in his self-interest, regardless of the context. But the interesting thing about Batman being there is that Batman is the ultimate polar opposite to what the governmental themes here are doing. Batman is very much like a Rawlsian redistributor of justice and of power, and making sure everyone has equal advantages. And so he's a force of illegitimate violence to curb the monopoly on violence that government has. And so Batman represents the ideal state of what the world should be, the U.S. government embodying the worst case scenario, and then Waller being in between and sort of forcing her way out of the government, getting to a more materialistic place like what a Wayne Fortune would do to you, and then hopefully, though doubtfully, getting to where Batman is. And so she's kind of the most practical of both sides. And that stuff's really, really good. By the end of the story arc, the Cold War is over, and Amanda Waller says that she's worried about the fact that now the Suicide Squad is more necessary than ever, and that's something we've been dealing with in media for the last 5 years. That people claim that we don't need spies after the Cold War, but now that our enemies are no longer countries, it becomes more and more the case that we do need something like this, and that the world has not gotten better, it's gotten worse. And the Suicide Squad being ahead of its time in that they're actually dealing less with countries and dealing more with the kinds of problems we deal with today. And all that stuff is just really fascinating. It's really well done. I wish I read issues 40 to 43 a month after I read issue 39. There's kind of a getting the team back together, kind of I miss everyone vibe throughout the whole set of issues, and I just read all 12 issues in one day, so I didn't really get the full impact that that's supposed to have. But if anyone does decide to seek out these issues and read this run, I would recommend waiting like at least a couple days, if not a month, between issue 39 to 40 to kind of have the space of the Suicide Squad is shut down, and where do we go now boggle around in your mind before getting to the resolution of that with the Phoenix Gambit. So this stuff is fantastic. If you don't love Suicide Squad, by the end of this wave of issues, then I don't think it's possible for you to. I think this is the highest point the book has reached so far, and we still have 24 issues left to discuss. So this will definitely be really exciting to go forward. Thanks everybody for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said, and I'll see you guys next time for another video.